I think it was in 2013 that I had a very intimate relationship to our next speaker. Not the kind of intimacy that you think, but the kind of bonding experience that just make you remember those few moments very, very clearly. It went like this. This is when you should mute me, because I'll say some very, very bad word now, like, my laptop just crashed, and I don't have a backup of my presentation. Dario, will you come up here? I hope you can do without any presentations, or at least you have a backup by now.
Yes, that was a long time.
So please welcome Dario Freddy.
Thank you. That was a very fun story, and I remember it was, I think, back in were we in Oslo maybe or somewhere?
No, it was a cafe in Moscow.
Yeah, exactly. So basically, my laptop crashed, and I will finish the story given that we have a couple minutes to spare. And I basically opened up the laptop and started coding the hell out of it and saying, okay, you know what? I don't have my presentation, so I'm just going to make it up right now and show you what I wanted to say. And it's pretty weird to be here today. I mean, it's great to see a lot of old friends here and talking about something completely different because a lot of years have passed and you move on. And actually, the first slide that I put together is exactly that, because I think that everyone here as a technologist, as a developer, eventually goes through this very low pixelated image of the 5 stages of grief because, well, as technology evolves, as we evolve, as time goes by, everything becomes more complex. And you come to the realization that what you're doing is kind of, becoming the problem itself. And the acceptance phase to me is mostly around this sentence, which is that technology, at the very end of the day, is just something that is meant to enable a use case. And you see this every day, right? I mean, one of the reasons why I've always been a great advocate of Qt, it is because it is great technology, but most of all, it always allowed me to do things fast. It allowed me to create products and create projects in a blazing fast way, and it got out of the way a lot of the complexity. And as life progresses, and I went by and I started, even changing jobs and changing what I did, I always came to the realization that technology is really something that should not get in the way. I mean, a lot of you build technology, a lot of us build technology, but what is our purpose when doing so? We need to be aware of the fact that our users, whoever is leveraging this technology, is always trying to make things faster and to make things easier. And in the last years, everybody was talking about the cloud and all that jazz. And it was supposed that cloud would have eaten the world. And it came with a lot of promises, a lot of which were absolutely, actually, real promises that were kept. But it was not the Holy Grail, as we all found out at the end of the day. We were promised a lot of faster turnarounds, developments. We would have changed the way we develop software. This has happened in a way. But you've been asking before who's building Qt from source, and I think, a third of the audience said yes. So I guess either we are all very old chaps by today, which might as well be, or still, some habits have changed, but some others haven't. And somehow, a lot of the technology that we have today in place is really meant for us to do things faster, but not necessarily replace things that we have always done in a very different way. And the learning curve is still there. I mean, today, if you look at the industry, a lot of people are talking about zero code, which is great, I believe. Coding sucks. But ultimately, it's a necessary evil, because you need to code. So zero code is really this kind of paradigm that, let's say, draws another very big gap between those who develop frameworks and develop, let's say, middleware, and those who develop applications who are demanding more and more for an easier experience, a simpler experience, in general, something that is, let's say, getting complexity technology out of the way. But the trend by which technology gets adopted goes pretty much the other way around. I mean, look at the market, look at what everybody is doing today. The demand for technology is increasing, and every company nowadays is supposing themselves as a technology company. Could be for valuation purposes, it could be because technology is cool, so hey, we are doing technology even if we are making, I don't know, an oven or something like that. But at the very end of the day, what really matters is that this is a central piece of the evolution of products. And so the Holy Grail is always the very same obnoxious sentence, which is done is better than perfect. Because when you look at how products are developed today, the real gap is speed. And I do believe that what really sets apart those who succeed and those who don't is the way you can build things faster. The faster you build something, the more likely it is that you're going to be successful. And for a very simple reason. As evolution paces forward and things become faster and customers become more aware, users become more aware, the demand increases and the gap between your thing and the next big thing is more and more small as time goes by. So being faster is becoming really all that matters. I remember I wrote a blog post a few years ago about the fact that the application developer is turning into a system integrator, and that was supposed to be a good thing, which made quite the buzz. And I think I still stand behind those words. I mean, who's developing application is requiring more and more frameworks to be at the edge of making things simple. So you need to be faster. You need to have things done easier to thrive in a scenario that is evolving as time goes by, and it will always be faster, I believe. Nowadays, I'm very involved in the embedded space, and the embedded space is, let's say, becoming weirder from the way I see it. Because there are so many evolutions and so many paradigms and trends that are happening that are very, very hard to keep up with. And most of all, the embedded space is extremely fragmented. Fragmented from a number of standpoints. First of all, you would assume that the market by itself is very ready for a number of things. If I'm talking about connected devices, if I'm talking about security or stuff, I mean, everybody in the audience here is going to say, okay, we've been talking about the same thing for the last 10 years. And it's right. Except the fact that the outer market is very much behind when it comes to the awareness and when it comes to the implementation of those things. And things are moving way slower in that space than us developers think. And of course, keeping up with such a fragmented space in which some companies are very far ahead and well far ahead of the curve, and some companies are just figuring out what the cloud even does, is very difficult because you have the whole span of complexity about making your users and your customers aware. But in all of this, the market demand and the market push, again, is tightening this gap on the bottom end, because of course companies who still haven't looked at the connected devices space are forced into doing that because customers are demanding so, and the competition is really pushing. And most of all, these days, I always like to say that companies are striving to build digital products. Digital products, to me, are basically embedded products which have a digital counterpart. So whether it's a mobile application, some kind of dashboarding, or some other digital service that you can name, but the convergent scenario is becoming more and more of a reality, and customers are demanding something that is very close to that rather than the typical physical product that they used to buy. And then there is the whole deal about data privacy and ownership. Now, this is really booming right now from what I see, and it's not just about the companies demanding privacy and ownership of their data. It's more about the users doing so. And I believe that users are becoming more and more aware of the fact that their data is valuable. I mean, we've been always used to say that if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. I think that this kind of thing stuck in the head of people. At some point, people realized that their data was valuable. And so they're now willing to go ways to protect that. And products need to be built by keeping this in mind. It's no longer like we can build a connected product which gets all of your data and gives you nothing back. Still the reward counterpart, so you give me your data, give you something back for free, kind of works, but some users are demanding more and more privacy and are valuing data more than the reward they're getting. So products need to take this into account. And then we have the whole edge space. So edge is the 1,000th time that we have a word that doesn't mean anything. What is the edge? Everything that has a CPU in it, I will say. So from your MCU controller to your MX8 board to your whatever you can think of today is the edge. And this concept by itself is creating a lot of problems, because when you talk about the edge, nobody really knows what you're talking about. I mean, go figure. Ultimately, I believe that there's two kinds of edge scenarios in which we're looking at. The first one being the physical product with a CPU or an MCU on board. And that will be your average embedded device, as the people that were coding in the 2010, like me, were calling them. And then you have the actual edge, which are these kind of small servers, which are meant to be embedded into a plant, into a manufacturing plant, a fabric, something like that. So somewhere you can have a sort of an IT infrastructure that is much more lightweight compared to what is used to be the typical IT infrastructure back in the days. And this whole span of computational power, that of course is very different, gives you all across the board infinite possibilities on how you can build your products. So how do you make sense out of this? I mean, what is the way you can build a proposition around that? Marketing slide. So that is what we've built at SECO, basically. So for those who know me, my company got acquired by SECO a couple years ago during the pandemic. Now at SECO, what we're trying to build is a company that is delivering a convergent proposition. What is a convergent proposition? It is something that takes care of the whole value chain that is needed for building a connected product, from the hardware platform to the software platforms to the consulting services at some point that are usually provided by partners in the most typical of approaches that are needed for customers to build their own products. And this is really probably the only way you can tackle a market that is that fragmented. Because at the end of the day, the difficult part of building such a business is that two different customers will never want the same thing. And that is really kind of a reckoning moment in which you understand that you need to build something that is flexible enough to make it work. Today, the company is making 200 million euros in revenue at the end of this year. We got listed on the Milan Stock Exchange in Italy, and we have recently been admitted into the Euronext Tech Leaders Index. That is, let's say, the European NASDAQ, or at least what we're trying to build as a European NASDAQ, even though talking about the market these days feels a little bit dizzy given what's going on. But ultimately, we are building a company that is really striving to be a successful player in the digital product space. How did we do that? And what are the, let's say, philosophy points that are bringing all of this together? And what are the key takeaways, as they call it? Well, first of all, we've been moving very fast on acquisitions. Earlier, I've been talking about how important it is to move fast for a developer. Now, I believe that this concept applies even more to anybody who's running a company or who's managing a team or who's managing a product. Because ultimately, moving fast really closes the gap between you and your competition, or extends the gap if you're far ahead. And in that case, acquiring companies allowed us to put together assets, both hardware and software, to make platforms work from day one. And that really gives you a big edge versus building everything in-house. And there's countless cases of things that really went south when you tried to build something you didn't know of, when you had a company and you were trying to switch to a different proposition. Before we joined SECO, I don't think that SECO had the slightest idea on how to build a connected data platform at all. So we came in and we led the way and we paved the way for creating the whole software division. And that is really probably the only way you can do something like that, because the know-how and the skills are definitely not for free, and most of all, are very difficult to build, because how will you manage a team when you don't even know what this team is doing? I mean, you need to have some skill sets within the company to understand whether your own team is building something that makes sense. This is why acquisitions and integration are usually the way you pave your way forward. Then again, understanding the market, I think it's really the pivotal topic, because as I mentioned before, staying ahead of the curve is super important, because ultimately your users, your customers will want something that is very innovative, will want something that is very up-to-date, or you call it whatever. But in a very fragmented market that is still serving a legacy audience, and a lot of you know what I'm talking about here, you need to serve the commodity market. When we talk about LTS in software, and when we talk about, let's say, everything that regards retrocompatibility, and there was a question about C++11, I almost got tears in my eyes, because when I started, C++11 was the next big thing on the block. So yeah, it's unsettling to hear that now we are like 12 years ahead. But in that kind of world, I mean, I remember, and Maurice told this, but C++11 came very late because we wanted to be compatible. I mean, Qt was used by a humongous amount of projects, users, and commercial customers. And it is definitely not easy to keep up with the demand of something new and serving everything that is currently working, and if it works, don't break it, don't fix it. That's usually what we say. So keeping up in such a fragmented world that spans 10 to 15 years of technology in a world where the next big thing is 6 months away, anything but trivial, but you got to do it because you are serving users, you're serving customers, and you need to respect that. And then again, when we talk about technology, we should never forget, as I said in the beginning, that we are just serving a use case. So you need to be technical, you need to serve technology, you need to serve great technology, but at the same time, you need to focus on the needs of your customers and users. I think this is super important, even if you're building an open source project. I mean, I can count endless projects that were born with not the greatest stack of technology or the greatest code, but we're serving a big deal of users. Let me just shout out to a project I know very well, which is GitLab. It's probably the most successful open source company in the last 10 years, and the original code was pretty crap. Well, apologies, but the original code base was not that great. But everybody was looking for a substitute to GitHub, and the old Gitorius, almost tears to our eyes when we talk about Gitorius, was just not making sense. And GitLab came up with a proposition that was simply great, and everybody was criticizing Ruby on Rails, it's too slow, we don't like it. Well, today, GitLab is listed on the NASDAQ, and it's a great company. And just because the product was great by itself, and the code base got eventually fixed. So we should never forget about the fact that great products evolve with great technology, but are born out of great use cases, and products and projects should solve real problems. Otherwise, they're meaningless. And we should not just build technology for the sake of technology at the end of the day. But what's the catch? I mean, when you go to the market and you say, okay, I am your one-size-fits-all, I can be your partner in providing you everything you need for building your product, you fall into a couple pitfalls that are usually these two I'm showing here. The first one is the lock-in. So, okay, what about tomorrow you decide that me and you are not working together, or I don't like you anymore? How do I escape that? I mean, how do I set myself free of the fact that your technology is locking me in? And that's, a problem that has been around forever. But most of all, just like the technology trade-off that I mentioned before, changes over time. So at the beginning, you want to solve a use case. At the end, you want great technology to sustain that use case. The trade-off between speed and control changes over time indeed, because when you're building a product, you want to be fast to ensure that this product goes to the market. And when it's done and when your product is successful, then it's all about how do I control that? I mean, how do I make sense out of my product? So all of the tools that have made you fast somehow need to keep you in control. If you wonder why AWS was so successful, think about this. I mean, the promise was you can build stuff very cheap and very fast, and we're going to share the revenue when you're going to grow. And that was a very, very successful model, because the shift towards control at the end of the project is what really gets money in the bank at the very end of the day. So, and people became aware of that, because we are like 10 or 15 years in the making. So people who have been building on the cloud in its early days know how the game works. So they want to ensure that they will get the biggest share possible of control at the very end of the day. That's why I still think that open source matters more than ever, because open source is kind of the solution to those things. At the end of the day, retaining control over something does not necessarily mean that I'm going to do things myself at the very end of the day. It means I'm still going to leverage my partners, I'm still going to leverage all the tools that I've used. The point is, how are these tools preventing me from taking further steps without asking someone? So open source really helps in creating this bond of trust between you and your providers, because everything is open and it's in the books. So trusting a provider that gives you something open, it is, of course, much simpler than trusting a provider that gives you something that is closed from day one. And this trust builds over time. It is indeed very difficult to kick off monetization with open source, but it's very rewarding at the very end of the day. So it is a slow-pacing reward mechanism. But at the end of the day, if you're looking at successful products that went into production, open source really mattered. And if you do open source right, I believe it is really the way by which you can pave some approaches and make a lot of sense out of what you're doing. Then again, data control. If you think about, once again, the trade-off between speed and control, at some point people start to talk about intellectual property, which is usually the most boring discussion you can have in the software space, at least for what concerns yours truly. Now, when you want to control data, of course, you can also control the evolution of your product. And when you control data, you can also control how your users are harnessing this data. Let's step back to privacy. When your product is successful, you need to give your users something back, because otherwise your users are just going to look somewhere else. As a matter of fact, giving them back their data is becoming more and more the best reward mechanism. At some point, we found out that the value of data is data itself, and if the users are aware, my best reward is, hey, here's your data, back to you. This really kind of resonates with the open source concept, because at the very end of the day, keeping things open allows me to change everything that I do in a pretty flexible way. Whether it's a technological product, whether it's an end product, I still have the flexibility to move around the way we use data and the way we provide data to our end users. And most of all, people have come to, let's say, the realization that the cloud is just another empty word. So what is the cloud? Something in the air, something where I click and something gets deployed somewhere. Perfect. But at the very end of the day, we've lifted out the whole concept of a single cloud vendor when we talk about the cloud. The reason why our product, which was a starter, was successful was because we invested very early in Kubernetes. And we got, on one hand, very lucky. On one hand, we were very good at understanding that Kubernetes was going to be the future of cloud. And today, pretty much every building block in the cloud is built on Kubernetes. Now, I still believe that Kubernetes has been one of the biggest revolutions that has ever happened in the software space, and probably the biggest one in the last 10 years. This is because it completely broke up the concept of how we develop applications in the cloud, and it lifted the requirement of having to depend on a specific cloud provider to build something that was scalable and deployable in very different scenarios. Now, these days, when you say Kubernetes, everybody associates Kubernetes to the cloud, but we should always remember that all of this was born out of open source roots, and it was meant to keep the cloud more open. At the very end of the day, all of the CNCF projects, like them or not, are open, and I think this really matters when you look at why the cloud is still becoming relevant and successful. I don't believe that if the cloud remained closed forever, and if we were stuck on some commercial providers, we would have had the adoption that we have today. So I still think that foundational frameworks are meant to be open source, and the future is still very open the way I see it, because I don't really see another way that this could move forward. And if you look at the bigger picture of Qt, I still think that everything that I say is very relevant. I mean, today we are still seeing that Qt is the most adopted framework when it comes to embedded development. 10 years ago, we were wondering, okay, will containers kill Qt? Will HTML5 be more attractive? Will Chromium kill us? Blah, blah, blah. Well, indeed, some projects have moved. Will Android kill us? I forgot to write Android in here. And of course, indeed, something happened, and some developers shifted to different frameworks. But at the very end of the day, I am still seeing that Qt is the framework of choice. And I think it is definitely for most of the reasons I outlined before, including the fact that Qt has stayed very true to its roots. And it's a core development framework that is basically code once, deploy anywhere, right? And that's why containers were like, okay, Qt is going to die. But surprise, it's not. Point is, Qt has been very solid, and developers have had the very same experience for years. And if something works, usually you stick to that. And the fact that Qt remained open, regardless of its many transitions, it is still a very solid argument that customers make. I always find myself talking about the fact that relying on an open framework matters. And customers see a lot of value in Qt being open, just yet. And shout out to KDE as always, because the KDE Free Qt Foundation still matters, and it's a big guarantee when it comes to saying that Qt will remain open in the forthcoming future. And that is, of course, a big thing. So ultimately, Qt is still ticking a lot of the boxes, and these days Qt feels like the old kid on the block when you look at all the new fancy frameworks coming out. But I still think that if technology evolves, but the very core reasoning why we develop and deploy applications still remains the same, as long as Qt checks all the marks, it will remain relevant for the very simple reason that it's still making our job easier and faster. And so Qt is just doing the job that I think it's supposed to do, and I think a technology framework is always supposed to do to get out successful products. So I don't want to extend for 10 more minutes. I won't kill your coffee breaks, of course. So I guess Maurice just bought us 10 minutes for coffee. And I just want to close out with a couple remarks on how I see technology in the future and where it moves forward. The first part is, as I mentioned before, non-technical companies are getting increasingly exposed to technology. Is this a good thing? Hell yes. Because ultimately, in some ways, technology is a tool, but we don't want to have a lot of companies unaware of the technology they are using. So getting exposed and understanding that they need to understand technology, it's nothing but a good thing, in which the learning curve matters. I wrote not necessarily the one you think of, because you might think about, okay, what is the learning curve for Rust, for Qt, for Kubernetes, for whatever. The learning curve in a company is the understanding of the management and everyone in between of how technology matters and why it matters and why they should adopt something. And this learning curve is usually the steepest one, because it's not always that consolidated management teams can understand the transition and can understand the value of transitioning to a non-technology company to a technological company. And that is really the monster you're fighting against when you're trying to bring technology to a traditional company, let's call them that way. But it's inevitable. And once again, the fastest ones will be the ones who will thrive. And then, technology has to be made simple. Indeed, I've been saying that for like the last 20 minutes, but keeping things simple does not mean to scrap out all the technical details and saying that they don't matter. You can be very simplistic while talking technology. So this is something that I thought about quite some time with a number of people. Simplifying a technology message does not mean to strip out the technology bits. It means making people aware that technology matters in a simple way. You don't need a 3 hours workshop to get somebody to understand why technology matters. And most of all, it is very, let's say, dangerous to point out that keeping it simple means scraping technology out of the way. You can do both. It's simply a little bit harder, but once again, those who thrive are the ones who are going to succeed. Let's say, no one ever asked for this opinion of what's coming next of all of this. Well, I believe that the gap between what I call framework or middleware developers and application developers will keep on extending, just like it has been over the last years. We will see more and more developers who will demand zero code, no code, faster code, whatever, build an application just by drag and dropping things. And we will see a lot of them, because as this new wave of companies and users will demand more technology, the demand will increase in terms of how fast can you build that. So framework developers will strive to build frameworks that will be making life easier and faster for application developers, and this gap will further extend in skills. You wonder why it's so hard to hire? Go figure. Because everybody wants to drag and drop, but ultimately somebody has to write the whole thing that drags and drops. So that's why everybody's hiring. Faster turnarounds, yes, indeed, but trade-offs are starting to matter. If 10 to 15 years ago we were just looking at get me something that does things faster, get me the best technology out there to build my stuff, now we are just asking what is the catch? So the catch is becoming very, very relevant. And new frameworks, everything that comes afterwards will have to care about this. It's not like you can build a product or a framework for what matters without telling the users or the developers what is the catch behind it. So we are no longer in the territory in which we can get out a product and say, yeah, use it because it's great, and then we will talk about it. Users and developers and companies are becoming more aware, so I think that the trade-offs have to be very clear from day one. And then for what it's worth, and that's also my hope, but I think it's inevitable from one standpoint. In the embedded space, convergent propositions will dominate the market. Arguably, they already are. But if you look at consumer products, that is indeed true. But if you look at what we call industrial products, so machinery and devices which are served and used by industrial companies, manufacturing companies, professional studios, you name it, we are still lagging far behind. And the demand for these kind of connected products and the attached services is just beginning. Now, these kind of things revolutionize the business model of both who creates the product and who acquires the product towards more of a subscription-based approach that is, let's say, very common for us as end users, but very uncommon for companies which are switching, as we say it, from CapEx to OpExes. So from capital investments in which I buy something to a sort of a lease in which I pay for something on a recurring basis, and I don't acquire the asset. That's a very big shift in paradigm that I think that poses the biggest opportunity, of course, for who develops services and products, because these companies have to rethink the way they do business, and to do so, they need the tools, they need the services, they need the software at the very end of the day, because it is about software, to make it happen. And that's basically ours to create. So I think that all in all, we are looking at a very interesting future that maybe you already knew about, but I felt like talking about. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Might have time for a single question if you dare.
I dare.
You dare. It's not
if
like,
somebody is brave enough.
Yeah. Can somebody turn off his presentation and see if he can answer without?
Yeah.
Any questions? You're all just thinking about your coffee breaks, huh?
Of course. I scared them first, and now there's coffee, so what?
Yeah. So you talk about connected world.
Yeah.
When I sit there in my sofa at home and I want to listen to some music, I need to bring up one app to start Spotify, another app to the receiver, and yet another app for my amplifier.
Best timeline.
It's amazing, isn't it? But how do we not end up in a world where there's only going to be Google and Apple and nobody else if I want them all connected?
Well, we've been asking us this question for the last 15 years, I guess. The point is, so the realistic turnaround is I don't think that there is any interest by anyone to develop a common standard, because you don't make money on the wire. So that is really the main delusion we have to get over to start talking about this topic. I think that customer demand eventually will push us towards that, but me and you are very atypical users because we are using all these apps. Most people are just turning on the remote. So I think that currently in the home, the way I see it, there is a central hub, which is the television. And Samsung have done a great job about it, for example. But I don't think that users are yet to the point in which they have our problem. So as usual, we are outcasts and we have to live with our crappy world we have.
Did he just call me an outcast?
I call myself an outcast.
Okay. Will you be around for the next few days? Because
of course
as the HR director, which I'm also, I might have a thing to talk to you about, or two, when it comes to the only way to grow is by buying companies. I'm not sure
Always open to discuss.
Anyway, before you run to the coffee break.
Okay, so let me make the hiring announcement. If you have any interesting companies in this space, come talk to me. Very simple.
There we are. Before you run off to the coffee break, at 11 o'clock we'll start again. And just remind you, you go out, the coffee break's in here, you go out into that hallway, there's a small staircase up. And if you want to take the elevator, it's also in this general direction over there. At 11 o'clock, there's going to be two presentations. I'm looking at my phone now because in contrast to the early days at QtDev Days, we actually do have an app. I don't think we even knew what an app was back then, but anyway. So at 11 o'clock right here, there's going to be proteins, microscopes, and Qt. How modern biotech fights C? Must be cancer. And upstairs at level 4, we have integrating Qt into legacy MFC application. How many of you are old enough to know what MFC is? There we are. Anyway, coffee break in there. Thank you so far.